She poured coffee like she'd done it a million times before, steady hands that never spilled a drop even when the cup was shaking in the customer's grip. But when three strangers walked into Rosie's diner at 2:47 a.m. with blood on their shoes and murder in their eyes, they made one fatal mistake. They looked at the woman behind the counter and saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a tired waitress in a stained apron who wouldn't be missed. They had no idea that the person refilling their coffee had once been the most feared name whispered in boardrooms from Moscow to Shanghai. Want to know why these killers chose the wrong diner and the wrong woman to underestimate? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Rosie's diner with the persistence of someone who had nowhere else to be. Each droplet caught the neon glow from the flickering sign outside, casting shifting patterns of pink and blue across the cracked linoleum floor. The clock above the cash register read 2:30 a.m., that dead hour when the world belonged to insomniacs, shift workers, and people running from things they couldn't name. Elena Vasquez moved through her closing routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had perfected the art of invisible efficiency. 37 years old, with laugh lines that spoke of better times and calloused hands that told stories of hard work. She wore her uniform like armor polyester that had seen too many wash cycles, sensible shoes with worn heels, an apron that bore the battle scars of 1,000 late-night shifts. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with a rubber band that had definitely seen better days. To anyone watching through the rain-streaked windows, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be: another small-town waitress grinding through another lonely night shift in another forgotten corner of America. Nothing about her suggested she had ever been anything more than what she appeared to be in this moment, wiping down tables that would be dirty again by morning and counting tips that wouldn't pay the rent. Millbrook, Tennessee wasn't the kind of place that attracted attention from anyone important. Population 3,847, according to the faded welcome sign on Highway 49. Though that number hadn't been updated since 1997, and several of those people had moved away or passed on without anyone bothering to adjust the count. It was the kind of town that existed in the spaces between more important places, where the biggest excitement usually involved high school football games and disputes over parking spaces at the farmer's market. The diner sat at the intersection of Main Street and nowhere in particular, a relic from the 1950s that had somehow survived urban renewal, chain restaurant invasions, and the general decline of places where people used to gather just to be around other people. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches, a counter with stools that squeaked when you turned them, and a jukebox that played the same 15 songs it had been playing since the Carter administration. Elena had been working at Rosie's for 3 years, ever since she'd appeared in town with a beat-up Honda Civic, a reference letter from a diner in Arkansas that checked out when anyone bothered to verify it, and the kind of quiet competence that made managers stop asking questions about gaps in employment history. She showed up on time, worked whatever shifts needed filling, never complained about difficult customers or broken equipment, and minded her own business with the dedication of someone who genuinely preferred that others do the same. The regulars had grown to appreciate her steady presence. She remembered how Jerry liked his eggs, knew that Mrs. Patterson would always order decaf but would complain if he didn't ask, and had mastered the art of pouring coffee without interrupting conversations that weren't meant for her ears. She existed in their peripheral vision like good wallpaper noticed only when absent, appreciated mostly in retrospect. But Elena Vasquez hadn't always been a waitress in a forgotten town. She hadn't always worn polyester uniforms or worried about tips or calculated how many double shifts it would take to fix the transmission in her aging Honda. There had been a time when her name carried weight in circles, where power was measured in body counts and silence was more valuable than gold. A time when she wore different kinds of uniforms, carried different kinds of tools, and solved problems that couldn't be fixed with extra cream and a patient smile. That was before she'd made the decision to disappear. Before she'd traded one kind of survival for another. Before she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could be was exactly who you used to be. The bell above the door chimed as Elena finished wiping down the last table in section 3. She looked up expecting to see one of the usual late-night visitors, Tommy from the gas station, grabbing coffee before his shift started. Or maybe Dr. Morrison heading home from the hospital after a particularly long day. Instead, she saw 3 men she'd never encountered before, and something about them made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in recognition of danger she hadn't felt in years. They moved wrong. That was her first observation, catalogued, and filed away in the part of her mind that had been trained to notice things that didn't belong. The way they entered not together, but in a sequence that suggested coordination. The way their eyes swept the interior of the diner, not casual observation, but tactical assessment. The way they positioned themselves, creating angles, controlling sight lines, blocking potential exits. The first man was tall and lean with the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent most of his time indoors or underground. His clothes were expensive, but unremarkable dark slacks, button-down shirt, leather jacket that was trying too hard to look casual. His hair was cut short and neat, and his hands were soft except for calluses in very specific places that Elena recognized as the signature of someone who handled certain kinds of equipment on a regular basis. The second man was shorter and broader, with the heavy build of someone who'd played football in college, and then spent the next 20 years letting muscle turn to fat, while maintaining the swagger of someone who remembered being intimidating. His jacket didn't quite conceal the bulge under his left arm, and he had the habit of touching it periodically like a security blanket. His eyes were small and mean, the kind that enjoyed watching things break. The third man was different from his companions in ways that made Elena's internal alarm system shift into higher gear. He was older, maybe 50, with gray streaking through brown hair, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of experience in places where experience was measured in survival. He moved with economy, said nothing, and kept his hands visible, and relaxed in a way that suggested he didn't need to touch weapons to be dangerous. This one had been trained by people who knew what they were doing. They took seats at the counter, spacing themselves with the kind of casual precision that wasn't casual at all. Elena approached with coffee pot in hand and the expression of someone who'd served thousands of late-night customers without incident or interest in their personal business. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough warmth to be professional without being memorable. The heavy-set man looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl. "Yeah, coffee. And whatever food you got that won't kill us." His accent was Eastern, maybe New York or New Jersey, definitely not local. The tall man nodded when she looked at him, but said nothing. The older man, the dangerous one, met her eyes briefly and said, "Coffee's fine, thank you." Elena poured 3 cups with the steady hand of someone who'd performed this simple task thousands of times. She didn't spill, didn't hesitate, didn't show any sign that these customers were different from any others. But while she worked, she listened. She observed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She cataloged details with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on noticing things that others missed. Their clothes were expensive, but not regional. The kind of brands you found in major cities, not small Tennessee towns. Their shoes were wrong 2 leather dress shoes and 1 pair of boots that had never seen farm work or construction sites. They smelled like cigarettes and something chemical that Elena's trained nose identified as gun solvent. Fresh gun solvent, applied recently and not quite aired out. Kitchen's been closed since midnight, Elena said, setting down the coffee cups. But I can make sandwiches. Ham, turkey, cheese. Nothing fancy. The heavy-set man grunted his approval. Ham, mustard, whatever bread you got. His companions ordered turkey and plain cheese respectively, and Elena headed to the kitchen area. Behind the service counter. The diner's layout was simple and familiar: counter seating for 6 booths along the windows, a pass-through window to the kitchen, and a back door that led to the alley where the dumpster lived, among other things that belonged in the dark. While she assembled sandwiches on the kind of white bread that had been feeding truck drivers and insomniacs for decades, Elena listened to their conversation. They weren't trying to be quiet, which told her either they were supremely confident or supremely stupid. Given the precision of their positioning and the older man's obvious competence, she was betting on confident. Road Atlas says we're about 40 minutes out, the tall man was saying, assuming the information is accurate. It's accurate, the older man replied with the certainty of someone who'd checked and double-checked. Question is whether we're expected, the heavy-set man snorted. By who? These people don't even have cell towers that work half the time. Far as the world knows, we're just passing through. Elena's hands never paused in their work, but her mind was racing through possibilities. 3 out-of-town men with weapons and attitudes, discussing travel times and expectations, arriving in the middle of the night in a town where strangers were rare, and strangers with money were even rarer. They weren't lost tourists. They weren't salesmen. They weren't visiting family. They were hunters. And they were hunting something or someone in Millbrook. She returned to the counter with 3 plates, each sandwich cut diagonally, because that's how you presented food when you took pride in your work, even when your work was assembling processed meat and cheese at 3 in the morning. The men accepted their food with the distracted attention of people whose minds were elsewhere, planning something that required their focus. You been working here long? The heavy-set man asked around a bite of sandwich. The question was casual enough, but Elena caught the calculation behind it. He was fishing for information, trying to determine how much she might know about local patterns, local people, local secrets. Few years, Elena replied with the kind of vague honesty that satisfied curiosity without providing useful details. Pretty quiet place most of the time. Quiet's good, the older man said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he appreciated quiet for professional reasons. Quiet means people mind their own business. Elena nodded agreeably while refilling coffee cups. That's the truth. Folks around here pretty much keep to themselves. What she didn't say was that she'd chosen Millbrook, specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where strangers could become invisible if they worked at it, where someone could build a new life without constantly looking over their shoulder for ghosts from the old one. She'd been living proof that it was possible to disappear completely if you were willing to work hard enough at being ordinary. But ordinary was a performance, and she'd been performing it so long that she'd almost forgotten it was an act. Almost. Convinced herself that Elena the waitress was who she really was, that the other person, the one with different skills and different kinds of experience, was just a character from someone else's story. These 3 men were a reminder that some stories never really ended. They just waited in the shadows until circumstances brought them back into the light. The rain continued its steady assault on the windows, creating a curtain of sound that isolated the diner from the rest of the sleeping world. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed their eternal tune while the coffee pot gurgled and the ancient refrigerator cycled through its mechanical breathing. Normal sounds. Comfortable sounds. The kind of acoustic backdrop that had lulled Elena into believing she was safe. "So what brings you fellows through our little town?" she asked with the practiced curiosity of someone who'd learned that small talk was part of the job, even when you didn't particularly care about the answers. The tall man looked up from his sandwich. Business. The word hung in the air like Smoke from a cigarette, carrying implications that Elena's trained instincts recognized immediately. Business conducted at 3 in the morning by armed men who positioned themselves tactically and discussed expectations wasn't the kind that got handled in office buildings or conference rooms. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for," Elena said with the bland sincerity of someone who dealt with travelers on a regular basis. She turned away to busy herself with unnecessary cleaning, but she was listening with the intensity of someone whose survival had once depended on parsing conversations for actionable intelligence. "Oh, we will," the heavy-set man said with confidence. That sounded like a threat. "It's just a matter of time." The older man shot him a look that suggested he talked too much, but the damage was done. Elena had been in enough similar situations to recognize the dynamic two subordinates and a professional, hunting something specific in a small town where they expected to have advantages that their target wouldn't possess. They finished their sandwiches in relative silence, occasionally exchanging glances that carried meanings Elena couldn't decipher, but could recognize as communication between people who'd worked together before. The kind of wordless coordination that came from shared experience in situations where mistakes had permanent consequences. Elena continued her closing routine, moving around the diner with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd done this same sequence hundreds of times. But while she worked, she was thinking, processing, calculating odds and options with the kind of analytical precision that had nothing to do with waiting tables and everything to do with staying alive. 3 professionals with weapons and obvious coordination, operating in a small town where they expected to have tactical advantages. Hunting someone who they expected to find here. People who moved like they had training and resources and experience in making problems disappear permanently. The kind of people Elena used to be. The kind of people Elena had spent 3 years hoping she'd never see again. She finished wiping down the counter and began the process of shutting down the coffee station, movements automatic while her mind worked through scenarios. They could be hunting anyone, some local resident with a past they thought they'd escaped, someone who'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, someone who owed money or information or favors to people who collected debts with bullets instead of lawyers. But something about their confidence, their casual assumption that they'd find what they were looking for in a place where finding anything required local knowledge, suggested they had information. Good information. The kind that came from sources who knew what they were talking about. The kind of information that someone might have about a waitress who'd appeared in Millbrook 3 years ago with no local connections and a reference that checked out a little too perfectly. Elena felt the familiar cold settling in her stomach, the ice-water realization that the life she'd built might be nothing more than borrowed time finally coming due. She'd known this moment was possible. Had prepared for it, planned for it, hoped it would never come, but understood that hope wasn't a strategy. The heavy-set man finished his coffee and pushed the cup away with the satisfied grunt of someone who'd gotten what he needed. "What do we owe you?" Elena calculated quickly, adding tax with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this. Math thousands of times. 1850. He pulled a 20 from his wallet and laid it on the counter. "Keep it." The tip was adequate, but not memorable. Exactly the kind of amount that wouldn't stick in anyone's memory if they were asked about it later. These men understood how to move through the world without leaving impressions that lasted longer than necessary. They stood to leave with the same coordination they'd shown entering, spacing themselves appropriately, moving with purpose but not urgency. The older man, the dangerous one, paused at the door and looked back at Elena with eyes that seemed to catalog her appearance for future reference. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. "We might be back through this way." "You're always welcome," Elena replied with professional courtesy that masked the chill running down her spine. "We're here 24 hours. They left without additional conversation, disappearing into the rain and darkness beyond the neon. glow of the diner's sign. Elena watched through the window as they walked to a dark sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, too far away for her to see the license plate clearly, but close enough to note that it was new, expensive, and rental car. Anonymous. The vehicle pulled away into the night, taillights disappearing around the corner onto Highway 49, leaving Elena alone with the rain, and the humming fluorescence and the sudden certainty that her carefully constructed ordinary life was about to become very complicated. She finished her closing routine on autopilot, counted the register, wiped down surfaces that were already clean, turned off equipment that had been running since the Eisenhower administration. But her mind was elsewhere, running through protocol she'd hoped never to use again, checking mental inventories of resources she'd hoped never to need. 3 years of waitressing hadn't erased the instincts that had kept her alive in a different world. She still noticed exits and calculated angles and assessed threats with the automatic precision of someone who'd been taught that paranoia was just another word for professional competence. She still kept certain supplies in certain places, still maintained certain capabilities that had nothing to do with pouring coffee or remembering how customers liked their eggs. She just hoped she'd never need them again. Elena locked the front door of the diner and walked to her Honda in the employee parking area behind the building. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle that caught the light from the security lamp above the back door, creating halos of mist that turned the familiar surroundings into something from a dream or a nightmare. Her apartment was a 10-minute drive through empty streets that knew her Honda's engine sound by heart. She'd chosen the place specifically for its tactical advantages disguised as mundane. Convenience's ground floor with multiple exits, clear sight lines from all windows, neighbors who worked different shifts and minded their own business. Kind of location that looked like a sensible choice for a working woman on a budget, but functioned as a defensive position for someone who understood the value of controlling her environment. She parked in her designated spot and sat in the car for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the rain on the roof while she scanned the shadows for anything that didn't belong. Old habits that had saved her life more times than she could count, automatic responses that kicked in whenever the world shifted from predictable to dangerous. Nothing moved except rain and shadows. No unfamiliar vehicles, no figures in darkened doorways, no signs that anyone had been watching or waiting. But Elena knew that professionals worth their fee wouldn't announce themselves with obvious surveillance. They'd wait, watch, plan, and strike when their target was most vulnerable. She climbed the stairs to her second-floor apartment, keys ready before she reached the door, muscle memory guiding her through the precise sequence of locks and alarms that most people would consider excessive security for a waitress in a small town. Inside, she moved through her evening routine with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else: shower, comfortable clothes, cup of tea that she probably wouldn't finish. But while she performed these ordinary actions, her mind was working through less ordinary calculations. How much time she might have before they returned. What resources she could access without triggering alarms that would bring more attention. How many people in Millbrook might be at risk if she stayed and fought versus how many might be in danger if she ran and left them to ask questions of people who wouldn't appreciate being questioned. Elena Vasquez, the waitress, had spent 3 years building a life where the most complicated decision involved which brand of coffee to order for the diner. But the person she'd been before, the one with different skills and different kinds of experience, understood that some problems couldn't be solved with customer service and a friendly smile. Some problems required solutions that involved the kind of tools she'd hidden in places around the apartment where no one would think to look, maintained with the obsessive care of someone who understood that neglecting your equipment was the same as planning your own funeral. She finished her tea and went through the motions of preparing for bed, knowing she wouldn't sleep, but maintaining the routine, because routine was part of the performance, and the performance had kept her alive for 3 years. But while she brushed her teeth and set her alarm clock, She was also checking sight lines from her bedroom window and calculating how long it would take to reach the weapons, cash hidden behind the false panel in her closet. Elena turned off the lights and lay in bed listening to rain against the windows, thinking about 3 men who'd appeared in her diner like a message from a world she'd tried to leave behind. Professional hunters with expensive clothes and casual confidence, discussing business that brought them to small towns in the middle of the night. Tomorrow she'd go to work and pour coffee and serve eggs over easy to customers who saw exactly what she wanted them to see. A tired waitress in a polyester uniform who worried about tips and transmission repairs. She'd smile at their jokes and remember their preferences and exist in the comfortable invisibility of someone whose entire identity was built around being overlooked. But tonight, she was remembering what it felt like to be someone else. Someone who'd understood that survival was a skill that required constant practice, that safety was a luxury that could disappear without warning, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was exactly what everyone expected. Elena had chosen to disappear because she'd grown tired of being dangerous. But as she lay in the darkness listening to the rain and thinking about 3 strangers with weapons and intentions, she was beginning to understand that some choices weren't permanent. And some people never really disappeared at all. They just waited in the shadows until circumstances brought them back into the light. The morning sun filtered through Elena's bedroom curtains with the lazy persistence of light that had nowhere urgent to be. She'd been awake since 4:30, not from any alarm, but from the internal clock that had been calibrated by years of hypervigilance disguised as insomnia. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world outside clean and deceptively peaceful. Elena moved through her morning routine with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else. But today, each action carried additional weight. Shower with the bathroom door unlocked in position to see the front entrance. Coffee brewed strong enough to cut through fatigue that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Clothes selected not just for comfort and professionalism, but for range of movement and concealment of items that most waitresses didn't carry to work. The face in her bathroom mirror looked exactly like it had for 3 years, unremarkable woman in her late 30s. The kind of features that blended into crowds and slipped from memory after brief encounters. But behind her eyes was an alertness that hadn't been there yesterday, a sharpness that came from acknowledging that the performance of ordinary life might be approaching its final act. She arrived at Rosie's diner 40 minutes before her shift started, using her key to enter through the back door near the kitchen. The building felt different in the early morning quiet, shadows falling at unfamiliar angles, familiar spaces transformed by the absence of customers and conversation. Elena used the extra time to move through the diner with fresh eyes, cataloging details she'd grown accustomed to overlooking. The main dining area had good sight lines, but limited cover. The counter provided some protection, but would channel movement in predictable directions. The kitchen offered multiple tools that could serve alternative purposes, but also created a potential trap if someone blocked the exits. The back door opened onto an alley that connected to 3 different streets, providing escape routes, but also allowing approach from multiple directions. She was thinking like someone whose survival might depend on understanding how spaces could be used for things other than serving coffee and eggs. The mental shift felt both natural and foreign, like putting on clothes that still fit but carried the scent of a life she'd tried to forget. Betty Morrison arrived at 6:15 with the breathless energy of someone who chronically ran 5 minutes behind schedule. 62 years old with gray hair that she'd given up trying to control, and a laugh that could be heard from the kitchen when the dining room was full. Betty had been working at Rosie's since the Carter administration and treated the place like her personal kingdom. "Morning, honey," she called as she bustled through the front door, juggling purse and lunch bag and the thermos of sweet tea that accompanied her everywhere. "You're here early again. You know Marge don't pay overtime for voluntary enthusiasm, right?" Elena smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to appreciate Betty's commentary on everything from local politics to celebrity gossip. Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be useful. Betty paused in her morning setup routine, studying Elena with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 4 children and could detect trouble brewing from 3 counties away. "You feeling all right? You look a little peaked." The observation was accurate enough to be concerning. Elena had spent years perfecting the art of looking unremarkable, but Betty possessed the supernatural ability of certain small-town women to notice things that trained intelligence officers might miss. It was both endearing and occasionally problematic. "Just tired," Elena replied, which was true enough to pass casual scrutiny. "Weird dreams." Betty nodded with the sympathy of someone who understood that sleep could be elusive when your mind had too much to process. "Well, you let me know if you need to take a break today. Thursday mornings ain't usually too crazy, and I can handle things if you need to rest." The kindness in Betty's voice was genuine, untainted by any agenda beyond simple human concern for a coworker she'd grown fond of. Elena felt a sharp pang of something that might have been guilt, recognizing that Betty's friendship was based on knowing only half the truth about who Elena really was. The better half, perhaps, but still an incomplete picture that might shatter if circumstances forced the whole truth into the light. The morning rush at Rosie's diner was a relative term that described the period between 6:30 and 9 when local residents stopped by for coffee and conversation before starting their workdays. Farmers who'd been up since 4, construction workers heading to job sites around the county, office workers from the bank and the courthouse who preferred Betty's biscuits to whatever they could grab from the convenience store on Main Street. Elena knew them all by name and preference, had memorized their usual orders, and learned their personal histories through the casual intimacy that developed between people who saw each other regularly in the same context. Jerry Patterson liked his eggs over medium with wheat toast, always asked about her weekend plans, even though she never had any interesting ones to share. Mrs. Caldwell ordered decaf with extra cream and always left exactly 15% tip, calculated to the penny. Dr. Reynolds grabbed black coffee to go and sometimes shared updates about patients in the vague terms allowed by professional discretion. These were good people living ordinary lives in a place where the biggest excitement usually involved high school sports and arguments about the proper way to prepare barbecue sauce. They treated Elena with the casual kindness reserved for fixtures in their daily routine, friendly without being intrusive, interested without being nosy. They had no reason to suspect that their waitress had ever been anything other than what she appeared to be. But today Elena found herself studying their faces with different eyes, wondering which of them might be in danger if her past came calling. Jerry worked construction and had strong opinions about politics, but couldn't hurt a fly. Mrs. Caldwell taught Sunday school and knew everyone's business, but used her knowledge for organizing church potlucks rather than anything sinister. Dr. Reynolds had dedicated his life to healing people in a community that desperately needed medical care. None of them deserved to become casualties in a conflict that had nothing to do with their lives, and everything to do with choices Elena had made in a different world under a different name. The morning rush was winding down when the first sign of trouble appeared in the form of Tommy Watson from the hardware store. Tommy was normally a cheerful presence who liked to complain about the weather and share gossip about local politics, but today he looked troubled in a way that had nothing to do with inventory shortages or supplier delays. "Elena," he said as she refilled his coffee cup, "you notice any strangers around town lately? People asking questions about folks they don't know?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Elena kept her expression neutral while her mind raced through possibilities. Tommy wasn't the type to imagine threats or create drama from nothing. If he was asking about strangers, it meant he'd encountered something that made him uncomfortable enough to seek confirmation from someone he trusted. What kind of questions? Elena asked with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation, rather than gathering intelligence. Tommy glanced around the diner to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned closer with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing sensitive information. Had a fellow come into the store about an hour ago. Nice enough, I suppose, but something felt off about him. Asked about people who might have moved to town in the last few years. Said he was looking for an old friend he'd lost touch with. Elena's internal alarm system shifted into higher gear while she maintained the expression of someone hearing mildly interesting local gossip. Lot of people move through here. Did he describe this friend? Woman in her 30s, dark hair. Might be working service industry. Said they'd served together in the military and he wanted to reconnect. Tommy shook his head with the frustration of someone who couldn't articulate what bothered him about an apparently innocent encounter. Something about the way he asked, though, like he already knew more than he was letting on. The coffee pot in Elena's hand remained perfectly steady despite the ice water flooding her veins. Professional hunters conducting reconnaissance, gathering information about potential targets from sources who wouldn't recognize the questions as threats. Using cover stories that sounded reasonable while fishing for confirmation of details they already possessed. You give him any information? Elena asked, proud of how normal her voice sounded despite the chaos building behind her calm exterior. Told him I couldn't think of anyone matching that description. Tommy replied with the satisfaction of someone who'd followed his instincts despite not understanding them completely. But then I got to thinking about it, and I realized I don't really know much about you before you showed up here. Not that it's any of my business, he added quickly, but if someone's looking for you, figured you should know about it. Elena felt a wave of gratitude toward Tommy Watson that had nothing to do with his hardware store's reasonable prices and everything to do with his instinctive protectiveness towards someone he considered part of his community. He'd sensed danger he couldn't name and chosen to warn her rather than satisfy a stranger's curiosity, demonstrating the kind of loyalty that made small towns both vulnerable and fierce when threats emerged. I appreciate you telling me, Elena said, meaning it more than Tommy could possibly understand. Probably just someone confused about which town their friend ended up in. You know how it is with people moving around after the service. Tommy nodded, accepting the explanation while still looking troubled. Maybe so. But if you see anyone hanging around asking questions, you might want to mention it to Sheriff Martinez. Never hurts to be careful. Elena agreed that caution was wise while privately calculating how much time she might have before the strangers from last night returned with reinforcements and better intelligence. If they were conducting interviews with local business owners, they were being systematic about gathering information before taking action. That suggested professionalism and patience, which could work in her favor if she used the time wisely. After Tommy left, Elena continued her shift with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing familiar tasks while wrestling with unfamiliar problems. She served coffee and eggs, made small talk about weather and local news, maintained the performance of ordinary life while her mind worked through scenarios that had nothing to do with waitressing. The strangers knew she was in Millbrook. They had enough information to conduct targeted searches, which meant someone had provided details about her location and probable identity. That level of intelligence suggested either extensive resources or inside information from sources that shouldn't have existed. Elena had covered her tracks carefully when she disappeared 3 years ago. New identity documents that would pass all but the most sophisticated scrutiny, employment history that checked out under reasonable investigation, personal background that explained her presence in Millbrook without raising questions about her past. She'd been thorough, professional, paranoid, to a degree that had seemed excessive at the time, but now appeared barely adequate. But someone had found her anyway, which meant either her operational security hadn't been as tight as she'd believed, or someone with access to classified information had decided she represented a problem that needed solving. The lunch crowd began filtering in around 11:30, providing Elena with the distraction of increased activity and the cover of background noise that made private thoughts easier to maintain. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Part of her attention focused on orders and conversations, while another part monitored the street outside for signs of surveillance or unusual activity. Millbrook's Main Street was visible through the diner's front windows, offering clear sight lines to the courthouse, the bank, and most of the town's commercial district. Normal Thursday activity, people running errands, conducting business, living lives that had nothing to do with professional hunters or waitresses with secret histories. But Elena found herself cataloging every unfamiliar face, every vehicle that lingered too long in parking spaces, every person who seemed more interested in observation than participation. She was thinking like someone whose survival depended on noticing details that others would overlook. The mental transition felt both natural and unsettling, like discovering that skills you'd hoped to forget were still sharp enough to cut yourself if you weren't careful. Marge Thompson, the diner's owner, appeared around 1 o'clock with the harried expression of someone juggling too many responsibilities with insufficient time and resources. 55 years old, with the kind of practical competence that came from decades of running a small business in a small town. Marge had inherited Rosie's from her mother and maintained it with the stubborn determination of someone who understood that certain institutions were worth preserving, regardless of profit margins. "Elena, honey, I need to ask you a favor," Marge said as she surveyed the dining room with the critical eye of someone who noticed everything from burned coffee to crooked place settings. "I know you weren't scheduled for a double today, but Betty's got some kind of stomach bug and won't be in tonight. Any chance you could cover the evening shift?" Elena's first instinct was to decline, to maintain the boundaries of her carefully constructed ordinary life and avoid the additional exposure that came with extended hours in a public place. But her second thought was more strategic if professional. Hunters were gathering intelligence in Millbrook. Staying home alone in her apartment might be more dangerous than remaining in a public space where witnesses and potential allies were present. "Sure," Elena replied with the easy accommodation of someone who'd never turned down extra hours. "I could use the overtime anyway." Marge's relief was visible and genuine. "You're a lifesaver. I'll make sure you get time and a half for the whole evening, not just after 8 hours. The generosity was typical of Marge, who treated her employees like family and understood that loyalty was earned through actions rather than speeches about teamwork and dedication. Elena appreciated the kindness while privately hoping that Marge's faith in her wasn't about to be tested by circumstances that had nothing to do with serving food and everything to do with survival. The afternoon shift brought its own rhythm and regulars, different faces but similar patterns of human interaction that had sustained places like Rosie's Diner for generations. Elena moved through her duties with automatic efficiency while monitoring the street outside and processing the information Tommy had provided about strangers asking questions. Professional hunters conducting systematic reconnaissance meant she was dealing with people who understood operational planning and had resources to support extended surveillance. They wouldn't make impulsive moves or reveal themselves unnecessarily. They'd gather intelligence, identify patterns, and strike when conditions were optimal for success and minimal for complications. That gave Elena time to prepare, but it also meant she was facing opponents who knew what they were doing. The kind of people who'd been trained by organizations that understood the value of patience and the importance of overwhelming superiority when violence became necessary. Around 3:30, Elena noticed a man she didn't recognize sitting in a booth near the window with a cup of coffee that had been cooling for 20 minutes while he made occasional notes in a small notebook. Middle-aged, average height and build, clothes that were clean but unremarkable, the kind of appearance designed to blend into backgrounds rather than attract attention. He'd been watching the street with the casual interest of someone passing time, but Elena's trained eye caught the systematic nature of his observation. He wasn't daydreaming or people watching for entertainment. He was cataloging vehicles, noting patterns of movement, identifying potential complications or opportunities. She approached his table with coffee pot in hand and the professional smile of someone offering service rather than suspicion. "Warm that up for you?" "Please," he replied with the polite gratitude of someone who appreciated good service. His voice carried no accent she could identify, the kind of neutral pronunciation that came from either extensive travel or deliberate training in vocal neutrality. Elena refilled his cup while using the opportunity to glance at his notebook. The pages contained what appeared to be sketches of building layouts, notes about street configurations, and timing notations that suggested he'd been monitoring traffic patterns for extended periods. "You working on something interesting?" she asked with the casual curiosity of someone making conversation rather than gathering intelligence. He looked up from his notebook with the startled expression of someone who'd been caught doing something he'd hoped would go unnoticed. "Just some drawings. I'm an artist, sort of. Like to sketch small-town architecture." The explanation was reasonable enough to satisfy casual curiosity, but Elena noticed that his sketches were more concerned with tactical considerations than architectural details. Exit routes, sight lines, defensive positions disguised as artistic observations of buildings and streets. "That's nice," Elena said with the bland encouragement she'd offer to any customer sharing personal interests. "Millbrook's got some beautiful old buildings. The courthouse especially." "Yes, I noticed that," he replied, closing the notebook with movements that were casual but decisive. "Actually, I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something. I'm looking for someone who might live around here. Old friend from the service." Elena's smile never wavered while ice water flooded her veins. The same cover story Tommy had reported, delivered with the practiced casualness of someone who'd used it multiple times. Professional hunters using systematic approaches to gather information from sources who wouldn't recognize the questions as threats. "I'd be happy to help if I can," Elena replied with the friendly accommodation of someone whose job involved assisting customers with reasonable requests. "What's your friend's name?" The man hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Elena to understand that he was deciding how much truth to mix with his deception. Actually, that's part of the problem. She might be using a different name now. "We served together overseas, and sometimes people prefer to leave that part of their lives behind, you know." Elena nodded with the understanding sympathy of someone who'd heard similar stories from other veterans who'd found their way to Millbrook over the years. "That makes sense. A lot of folks come here looking for a fresh start." "Exactly," the man said with relief that seemed genuine. She'd be in her 30s, dark hair, probably working somewhere in the service industry. Quiet type, keeps to herself, but really good at whatever she does. The description was accurate enough to be concerning and vague enough to apply to several people in Millbrook, including Elena herself. Professional hunters using information that was specific enough to be useful, but general enough to avoid revealing how much they actually knew about their target. "Can't think of anyone matching that description." Elena lied with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that truth was a luxury that could be dangerous in the wrong circumstances. "But I'll keep my ears open. You got a card or something? In case I hear anything?" The man reached into his jacket with movements that were controlled and deliberate, producing a business card that looked professional but generic. "David Morrison, freelance journalist. I'm working on a story about veterans transitioning to civilian life, and she'd be perfect for what I'm researching." Elena accepted the card while noting that his jacket had fallen open enough to reveal a shoulder holster with professional-grade equipment. Freelance journalists occasionally carried weapons for protection in dangerous assignments, but this man's holster was positioned for quick access and concealment rather than deterrence or display. I'll definitely let you know if I hear anything," Elena said, tucking the card into her apron pocket with the professional courtesy of someone who collected business cards from traveling salesmen and insurance agents on a regular basis. David Morrison finished his coffee, left appropriate payment plus a modest tip, and departed with the unhurried pace of someone who had accomplished his immediate objectives. Elena watched through the window as he walked to a sedan parked across the street, noting that he moved with the controlled awareness of someone who'd been trained to notice potential threats while avoiding unnecessary attention. The afternoon continued its normal rhythm, but Elena found herself monitoring every customer with fresh attention, cataloging faces and behaviors for signs that additional reconnaissance was being conducted. Professional hunters working systematically would use multiple approaches and sources, gathering information from various angles to build comprehensive intelligence before taking action. She was dealing with people who understood operational planning and had resources to support extended surveillance. They wouldn't reveal themselves unnecessarily or take impulsive actions that might compromise their mission. They'd be patient, thorough, and overwhelming when they finally decided to move. Elena had perhaps hours, possibly days before they felt confident enough to transition from reconnaissance to direct action. Time she could use to prepare defenses, gather resources, or implement escape plans that she'd hoped never to need, but had maintained out of paranoid professionalism. But she was also facing a moral complexity that hadn't existed in her previous life. Then, she'd been responsible only for herself and whatever mission parameters had been assigned by people who understood the acceptable costs of necessary actions. Now she was part of a community that had welcomed her, surrounded by people who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. Running would keep her safe, but might bring danger to people who had no connection to her past and no ability to defend themselves against professional hunters. Staying and fighting would protect the community, but might result in violence that would shatter the peaceful existence these people had built in their small corner of the world. Elena finished her afternoon shift while wrestling with decisions that had no clean solutions, only choices between different kinds of damage and different categories of loss. The evening shift would bring different customers and different challenges, but the fundamental problem would remain unchanged. She was no longer just Elena the waitress who worried about tips and transmission repairs. She was someone with skills and experience that existed in violent shadows, facing opponents who understood that certain problems required permanent solutions. The performance of ordinary life was reaching its final act, and Elena was beginning to understand that some transformations couldn't be reversed once circumstances demanded their completion. The dinner crowd at Rosie's diner consisted mainly of families who discovered that eating out on Thursday night was cheaper than cooking at home when you factored in the cost of groceries and the value of not having to clean up afterward. Children who ordered chicken tenders and chocolate milk, parents who appreciated Betty's meatloaf, and the opportunity to have adult conversations without interrupting kitchen duties. Elena moved through the evening shift with practiced efficiency, but part of her attention remained focused on monitoring the street outside and processing the intelligence she'd gathered throughout the day. Professional hunters conducting systematic reconnaissance, using multiple approaches to gather information about potential targets without revealing their true intentions. She was facing opponents who understood operational planning and had resources to support extended surveillance. People who'd been trained to be patient, thorough, and overwhelming when violence became necessary. The kind of professionals who didn't make mistakes because mistakes in their line of work had permanent consequences. Around 7:30, Elena noticed another unfamiliar face at the counter. A woman this time, 40s, well-dressed but not ostentatiously, drinking coffee and picking at a piece of pie while occasionally glancing at other customers with the casual interest of someone people watching for entertainment. But Elena's trained eye caught the systematic nature of her observation. The way she seemed to be cataloging faces and voices rather than simply passing time. Another hunter conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about local patterns and potential complications. Elena approached with coffee pot and professional smile, offering service while gathering her own intelligence about this new threat. "How's the pie?" "Delicious," the woman replied with genuine appreciation. "Your baker knows what they're doing. I'll tell Marge you said so. She makes everything from scratch." Elena refilled the coffee cup while noting that the woman's jacket was cut to conceal weapons, and her positioning at the counter provided clear sightlines to both entrances. "You passing through or staying in town?" "Just passing through," the woman said with the casual honesty of someone sharing travel plans with a friendly waitress. "Though I might stick around for a day or two. This seems like a nice quiet place to rest." Elena nodded with the understanding sympathy of someone who'd seen plenty of travelers seeking refuge from busier, more complicated places. Millbrooks. Good for that. Not much excitement, but sometimes that's exactly what people need. "Sometimes it is," the woman agreed, and something in her tone suggested deeper meanings behind the simple words. "Though you never know what kind of excitement might be hiding in quiet places." The comment landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of implication that Elena absorbed without changing expression. Professional hunters often used oblique references to test targets, fishing for reactions that might confirm or deny suspicions without revealing their true intentions. "I suppose that's true," Elena replied with the bland agreement of someone making conversation rather than receiving threats. "Though most folks around here are pretty straightforward. What you see is what you get." The woman smiled with appreciation. "That might have been genuine or calculated. That's refreshing. So many people these days are pretending to be something they're not." Elena maintained her professional expression while processing the multiple layers of meaning embedded in seemingly innocent conversation. Professional hunters using psychological pressure to create stress and uncertainty, hoping to provoke reactions that would confirm their intelligence or reveal new information about their target's capabilities. "Well, I hope you enjoy your stay," Elena said with the courtesy she'd offer to any customer planning to remain in the area. "Let me know if you need recommendations for anything." The woman finished her pie and coffee, paid her bill with exact change, and departed with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd accomplished her immediate objectives. Elena watched through the window as she walked to a different sedan than the one used by the man that afternoon, confirming that multiple operatives were working coordination to gather intelligence from various sources. The evening shift continued its familiar rhythm, but Elena found herself calculating time and resources with the intensity of someone whose survival might depend on making the right decisions in an increasingly narrow window of opportunity. Professional hunters conducting systematic reconnaissance would eventually transition from information gathering to direct action, and she needed to be prepared for whatever form that action might take. Around 9 o'clock, the dinner crowd began thinning out as families headed home for homework and bedtime routines, leaving Elena with the usual collection of late-evening customers who preferred the diner's quiet atmosphere to the isolation of empty houses. She used the decreased activity to move through closing preparations while maintaining surveillance of the street outside. That's when she noticed the van parked in the shadows beyond the reach of the streetlights, positioned to provide clear observation of the diner's entrances while remaining hidden from casual notice. Professional surveillance using tactics that suggested extensive training and unlimited patience. Elena felt the familiar cold settling in her stomach, the ice-water realization that the reconnaissance phase was concluding and direct action might be imminent. She was facing opponents who understood operational planning and had resources to support whatever solution they decided was necessary. The performance of ordinary life was approaching its final scene, and Elena was beginning to understand that some stories ended with transformation rather than resolution. She continued serving customers and maintaining the facade of normalcy while her mind worked through protocols she'd hoped never to use again, checking mental inventories of resources she'd hoped never to need. The weapons cache in her apartment, the emergency funds hidden in places that would survive casual searches, the escape routes she'd memorized during her first week in Millbrook. But she was also thinking about the people around her who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, who'd welcomed her into their community based on nothing more than her willingness to show up and do good work. Jerry Patterson with his construction crew, and his weekend fishing stories, Mrs. Caldwell with her Sunday school classes and her precisely calculated tips, Dr. Reynolds with his dedication to healing people in a place that desperately needed medical care. They deserved better than to become casualties in a conflict that had nothing to do with their lives and everything to do with choices Elena had made in a different world under a different name. But protecting them might require her to become someone she'd spent 3 years trying to forget, to use skills that existed in violent shadows for purposes that couldn't be explained or justified to people who'd built their lives around peace and community. Elena finished her closing routine while wrestling with decisions that had no clean solutions, only choices between different kinds of damage and different categories of loss. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences her choices demanded, but tonight she was still a waitress in a small-town diner who poured coffee and remembered how customers liked their eggs. At least until circumstances forced her to remember who she'd been before Elena Vasquez existed, and what kind of person she'd need to become if survival required abandoning the performance of ordinary life. The transformation was already beginning. Synapses firing in patterns that had been dormant for 3 years. Muscle memory awakening from hibernation that had felt permanent but was revealed as merely temporary. Elena locked the diner's front door and walked to her Honda in the employee parking area, moving with the controlled awareness of someone who understood that tomorrow might demand capabilities she'd hoped never to use again. But some skills, once learned, never really disappeared. They just waited in the shadows until circumstances brought them back into the light. Elena's apartment felt different when she returned from her double shift at the diner. The familiar spaces seemed smaller, somehow shadows falling at angles that suggested vulnerability rather than comfort. She moved through her evening routine with heightened awareness, each sound from the hallway or adjacent units cataloged and analyzed for potential threats. The surveillance van had remained in position throughout her closing duties, its occupants patient in the way that suggested professional training and unlimited resources. They were watching, learning her patterns, calculating the optimal moment to transition from observation to action. Elena understood that she had perhaps hours before they felt confident enough to make their move. She made tea she wouldn't drink and sat at her kitchen table with the lights off, using the darkness to observe the street below without revealing her own position. The van was still there, invisible to casual observation, but obvious to someone who understood tactical positioning. Professional hunters maintaining surveillance while their target prepared for whatever confrontation morning would bring. Elena's mind worked through scenarios with the analytical precision of someone whose survival had once depended on anticipating multiple contingencies. They could attempt extraction during transport between her apartment and the diner, using the isolated morning streets to minimize witnesses and complications. They could stage an incident at Rosie's during operating hours, relying on civilian presence to discourage resistance. They could wait until after closing when she was alone and vulnerable. Each possibility carried advantages and risks that professional operators would have calculated carefully. Elena found herself thinking like them, evaluating options from the perspective of hunters rather than prey, and recognizing patterns that suggested extensive planning and resource allocation. The cellular phone she'd never used sat in the kitchen drawer, where it had remained untouched for 3 years, a relic from her previous life that she'd kept as insurance against circumstances she'd hoped would never arise. Elena retrieved it, with hands that remembered the weight and feel of equipment designed for purposes that had nothing to do with ordinary communication. The device powered on with the subdued efficiency of technology built for reliability rather than entertainment, displaying no missed calls or messages because no one possessed this number except people who existed in shadows that Elena had tried to leave behind. But some connections couldn't be severed completely, only suspended until necessity demanded their reactivation. She dialed a number from memory, digits that had been burned into her consciousness during training, that felt like someone else's life but remained accessible when survival required remembering skills she'd tried to forget. The connection established itself through encrypted channels that existed outside normal telecommunications infrastructure, routing through servers that had no official existence and left no traceable records. "Nightingale," a voice answered after the third ring, using the recognition protocol that identified Elena's device and confirmed that certain operational parameters remained active despite years of dormancy. "Requesting immediate extraction," Elena said with the economical precision of someone who understood that encrypted communications were monitored for efficiency rather than conversation. "Current position compromised. Multiple hostiles conducting systematic surveillance." The silence that followed contained calculations being performed by people who specialized in evaluating risk and resource allocation for assets that existed in operational gray areas. Elena waited with the patience of someone who understood that some decisions required consultation with authorities that didn't appear on organizational charts. "Extraction denied," the voice replied with the neutral tone of someone delivering information rather than personal judgment. "Asset designation changed to an active status 18 months ago. Support protocols no longer apply." Elena absorbed the information without surprise or emotion, recognizing that bureaucratic decisions made in climate-controlled offices often had life or death consequences for people operating in less controlled environments. She'd been cut loose, officially abandoned by the organization that had trained and deployed her for missions that still didn't appear in any public records. "Understood," she replied with professional acceptance of circumstances that couldn't be changed through argument or appeal. Closing this channel, the connection terminated with digital finality, leaving Elena alone with the knowledge that whatever happened in Millbrook would be resolved without official assistance or acknowledgement. She was facing professional hunters with resources and training that matched her own, but without the organizational support that had once provided advantages that individual operators couldn't maintain independently. Elena powered down the phone and returned it to the drawer where it would remain until circumstances required its destruction. She'd known this moment was possible when she'd chosen to disappear, understanding that some decisions created permanent consequences that couldn't be undone through regret or reconsideration. But she wasn't the same person who'd made that choice 3 years ago. Elena the waitress had developed connections and responsibilities that Elena the operative had never possessed. Relationships with people who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return except the simple human decency of showing up and doing good work. She moved through her apartment with deliberate purpose, retrieving items from hiding places that had been chosen for accessibility rather than permanence. The Glock 19 from behind the false panel in her bedroom closet, maintained in perfect condition despite years of hoping she'd never need it again. Spare magazines and ammunition stored separately according to protocols designed to prevent accidents, while ensuring rapid deployment. Cash reserves that would provide mobility and resources for extended operations. The tactical vest had been modified to appear like an ordinary piece of outdoor gear, its protective capabilities disguised beneath fabric that suggested hiking or camping rather than combat applications. The knife was equally deceptive, appearing like a standard utility tool while providing capabilities that extended far beyond opening packages or cutting rope. Elena assembled her equipment with the methodical precision of someone performing familiar tasks under stress, muscle memory guiding her through procedures that had been drilled until they became automatic responses to threatening circumstances. She was becoming someone she'd tried to forget, transitioning from performance to reality with the fluid efficiency of someone whose survival depended on adaptation. The transformation felt both foreign and natural, like putting on clothes that still fit despite changes in the person wearing them. Elena the waitress was disappearing, replaced by someone with different skills and different definitions of acceptable solutions to complex problems. She dressed in dark clothing that would provide concealment and freedom of movement, layers that could be adjusted for changing conditions while maintaining professional appearance if circumstances required interaction with civilians. The tactical gear remained hidden beneath an ordinary jacket that suggested someone prepared for weather rather than warfare. Elena moved through final preparations with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that dawn would bring whatever confrontation her choices had made inevitable. She couldn't run without abandoning people who'd shown her kindness. She couldn't hide without risking their safety. She couldn't negotiate with hunters who'd been sent to solve a problem that required permanent resolution. The options had narrowed to a single path that led through violence toward outcomes that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Elena accepted this reality with the professional detachment of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required actions that couldn't be justified through conventional moral frameworks. She left her apartment before sunrise, moving through shadows with the controlled awareness of someone whose training had emphasized stealth and misdirection over confrontation and display. The surveillance van was gone, its occupants having concluded their observation phase and transitioned to whatever operational planning their intelligence had supported. Elena reached Rosie's diner 40 minutes before her scheduled shift, using her key to enter through the back door while scanning for signs that the building had been compromised during the night. Everything appeared normal, but she understood that professional operators wouldn't leave obvious evidence of preparation or positioning. She moved through the familiar spaces with fresh eyes, evaluating defensive positions and escape routes with the analytical precision of someone whose survival might depend on understanding how ordinary environments could be used for extraordinary purposes. The kitchen provided tools that could serve alternative functions. The dining area offered sight lines but limited cover. The back alley connected to multiple streets, but also allowed approach from various directions. Elena was thinking like someone whose life depended on tactical considerations rather than customer service, processing environmental factors through training that had been designed to keep operatives alive in hostile territory. The mental shift felt both necessary and tragic, marking the end of 3 years spent trying to be someone whose biggest concern involved remembering how customers preferred their coffee. Betty Morrison arrived at her usual time with the breathless energy of someone who chronically ran 5 minutes behind schedule. But today her normally cheerful demeanor was tempered by obvious concern about circumstances she couldn't quite articulate. "Elena, honey," she said as she bustled through the front door, "I ran into Martha Henley at the grocery store last night, and she mentioned seeing some strangers around town asking questions about folks. You heard anything about that?" Elena maintained her expression of mild interest while processing information that confirmed her assessment of the situation. Professional hunters conducting systematic reconnaissance had been thorough enough to attract attention from observant residents, but subtle enough to avoid triggering official responses from local law enforcement. "Tommy mentioned something yesterday," Elena replied with the casual honesty of someone sharing workplace gossip rather than intelligence briefings. "Said someone came into the hardware store looking for an old military friend." Betty nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed through multiple sources. "That's what Martha heard too. Makes me nervous, you know. We don't get many strangers around here, and when we do, they're usually just passing through. These folks seem like they're planning to stick around." The observation was accurate and concerning, suggesting that professional hunters were confident enough in their intelligence to establish temporary operational presence rather than conducting quick strikes followed by immediate departure. They felt secure in their planning and resource allocation, which meant they'd identified factors that provided significant tactical advantages. Elena spent the morning shift monitoring customers and street activity while maintaining the performance of ordinary waitressing duties, but her attention was focused on recognizing patterns that might indicate preparation for imminent action. Professional hunters would choose their timing carefully, balancing operational requirements against civilian presence and potential complications. Around 10:30, she noticed the first sign that circumstances were escalating beyond surveillance and reconnaissance. A black SUV with tinted windows had parked across the street from the diner, positioned to provide clear observation of both entrances while remaining outside the range of casual scrutiny from customers inside. The vehicle's occupants weren't visible, but Elena's trained eye recognized tactical positioning that suggested coordination with other assets that weren't immediately apparent. Professional hunters using multiple platforms to establish overwatch and containment, ensuring that their target couldn't escape once direct action commenced. Elena continued serving coffee and eggs while processing the implications of what she was observing. Multiple operatives with coordination and resources, conducting operations in a small town where they expected to have overwhelming advantages over any resistance their target might offer. They'd planned carefully, allocated sufficient personnel and equipment, and chosen their timing to minimize complications while maximizing chances of success. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that Elena Vasquez, the waitress, was the same person they'd been sent to eliminate, failing to understand that 3 years of ordinary life hadn't erased capabilities that had been forged in circumstances where mistakes meant permanent consequences. The morning rush was winding down when Elena noticed movement that confirmed her assessment of the tactical situation. 2 men entered the diner with the casual coordination of people who'd worked together extensively, spacing themselves to control sight lines while appearing like ordinary customers seeking breakfast and conversation. She recognized the older man from her first encounter, the dangerous one whose movements suggested extensive training in environments where survival required constant vigilance. His companion was younger, broader, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from believing that superior numbers and equipment guaranteed favorable outcomes. They took seats at the counter with positioning that blocked Elena's access to the front door while maintaining clear fields of fire throughout the dining area. Professional hunters transitioning from observation to preparation, establishing control over the environment before revealing their true intentions. Elena approached with coffee pot and professional smile, maintaining the performance of ordinary service while calculating distances and angles with the precision of someone whose training had emphasized tactical awareness over customer satisfaction. "Coffee?" she asked with the same pleasant efficiency she'd offered thousands of customers who'd never represented threats, beyond demanding extra attention or leaving inadequate tips. "Coffee would be great," the older man replied with polite gratitude that masked whatever instructions he'd received regarding the resolution of problems that couldn't be handled through conventional channels. Elena poured 2 cups with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system, awakening responses that had been dormant for 3 years, but remained ready for activation when circumstances demanded their deployment. The younger man studied her with obvious assessment, comparing her appearance against whatever intelligence had been provided during their operational briefing. "You know, you look familiar. We might have some mutual friends." The statement was delivered with casual friendliness that didn't conceal its true purpose as a test designed to provoke reactions that would confirm or deny suspicions about Elena's identity and background. Professional hunters using psychological pressure to create stress and uncertainty while gathering final verification before committing to direct action. "I don't think so," Elena replied with the polite uncertainty of someone trying to place faces from memory while processing customers' conversational attempts. I'm pretty good with remembering people, and I don't think we've met before. The older man sipped his coffee with appreciation that might have been genuine or calculated, maintaining eye contact with the intensity of someone evaluating threats and opportunities while preparing for actions that would have permanent consequences for everyone involved. Maybe not directly, he said with the patient tone of someone working through predetermined scripts while waiting for optimal conditions to develop. But sometimes we know people through their reputation rather than personal introduction. Elena felt ice water flooding her veins while maintaining the expression of someone engaged in ordinary customer interaction rather than receiving threats disguised as conversation. Professional hunters confirming their target's identity while establishing psychological dominance before transitioning to whatever resolution their mission parameters required. But she was no longer just Elena the waitress who worried about tips and transmission repairs. The person she'd been before was awakening with the fluid efficiency of someone whose survival had once depended on rapid transition between ordinary appearance and extraordinary capability. Well, Elena said with the pleasant accommodation of someone ending conversations that had reached their natural conclusion, I hope you enjoy your coffee. Let me know if you need anything else. She turned away from the counter with movements that appeared casual but positioned her closer to the kitchen area, where tools and alternative exits provided options that ordinary waitresses wouldn't consider. But someone with different training might find useful under threatening circumstances. That's when the front door chimed again, admitting the woman Elena had observed conducting reconnaissance the previous evening. Professional coordination, ensuring that all assets were in position before commencing operations that required precise timing and overwhelming superiority. The tactical situation had developed exactly as Elena's training had taught her to expect. From competent opponents, multiple operatives controlling key positions, blocking escape routes, establishing fields of fire that would prevent resistance while minimizing damage to surrounding property and innocent bystanders. But professional hunters operating in unfamiliar territory sometimes failed to account for variables that weren't apparent during reconnaissance phases. They'd observed Elena serving coffee and eggs, cataloged her apparent capabilities and limitations, developed operational plans based on the assumption that waitresses possessed predictable skill sets and response patterns. They hadn't considered the possibility that some people were exactly who they appeared to be until circumstances forced them to become someone entirely different. Elena moved toward the kitchen with the unhurried pace of someone attending to ordinary duties while her mind processed tactical considerations with the analytical precision of someone whose survival had once depended on making correct decisions under extreme pressure. The transformation from performance to reality was nearly complete, synapses firing in patterns that had been dormant for 3 years but remained accessible when survival demanded their activation. The older man spoke quietly to his companions, words Elena couldn't hear clearly but recognized as final coordination before commencing whatever action their mission parameters required. Professional hunters preparing to transition from surveillance to resolution, confident in their planning and resource allocation. Elena reached behind the service counter where ordinary restaurant supplies concealed items that had been positioned for accessibility rather than convenience. Tools that appeared utilitarian but provided capabilities that extended far beyond food preparation and customer service. She was no longer Elena Vasquez, the waitress who'd spent 3 years building an ordinary life in a small town where the biggest excitement usually involved high school sports and disputes over barbecue sauce recipes. She was someone with different skills and different definitions of acceptable solutions to complex problems. The performance of ordinary life was ending, replaced by realities that existed in violent shadows where survival required actions that couldn't be justified through conventional moral frameworks. Elena had tried to disappear, But some transformations couldn't be permanent when circumstances demanded their reversal. Professional hunters had found her, but they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that time and ordinary employment had erased capabilities that had been forged in environments where weakness meant death and hesitation meant failure. They were about to discover that some skills, once learned, never really disappeared. They just waited in the shadows until circumstances brought them back into the light. Elena's hand found the grip of the weapon she'd hoped never to use again, muscle memory guiding her through procedures that felt both foreign and familiar. The person she'd been was returning with lethal efficiency, awakening from hibernation. That had felt permanent, but was revealed as merely temporary. The morning sunlight streaming through Rosie's diner windows illuminated a scene that appeared perfectly ordinary: customers drinking coffee, waitress attending to duties, small-town life proceeding with comfortable predictability. But beneath the surface, forces were converging that would transform ordinary spaces into extraordinary circumstances, where survival depended on capabilities that existed far beyond anything resembled normal customer service. Elena had spent 3 years trying to forget who she'd been, but forgetting and losing were different things entirely. Some identities could be buried but never destroyed, waiting in patient dormancy until necessity demanded their resurrection. The wait was ending, the performance was concluding, and Elena was about to remember exactly why professional hunters should have been more careful about which waitress they chose to underestimate in a small town where strangers stood out, and locals protected their own. The transformation was complete. What happened next would determine whether Elena's new life survived the collision with her old one, or whether some stories could only end one way regardless of how much time passed between chapters. The ceramic coffee mug shattered against the wall behind the older man's head, sending fragments across the counter as Elena dove behind the industrial freezer. His reflexes were sharp enough to duck the improvised projectile, but not quite fast enough to avoid the scalding coffee that followed its trajectory. Contact! He barked to his companions while drawing his weapon with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed this motion thousands of times under stress. But Elena was already moving, using her intimate knowledge of the diner's layout to disappear into spaces that tourists and casual observers never noticed. The younger operative spun toward the kitchen area, his pistol tracking movement he couldn't quite see, but knew was there. Where did she? His question was cut short by the industrial mixer's heavy bass connecting with his temple, wielded by hands that understood leverage and targeting with surgical precision. He dropped without completing his sentence, weapon skittering across the linoleum toward the prep station where it would do him no good. The woman by the door was faster, smarter, already moving to flank Elena's position while her partner provided covering fire that chewed chunks from commercial refrigeration units and sent stainless steel fragments spinning through the air like deadly confetti. Elena rolled beneath the prep table as bullets sparked off surfaces that had never been designed to stop military-grade ammunition, coming up with the serrated bread knife that felt perfectly balanced despite being intended for slicing sourdough rather than flesh. The blade found its target between the woman's ribs with the kind of precision that spoke to training, received in facilities that didn't appear on any public maps. The operative's eyes widened with surprise that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the sudden understanding that their intelligence briefing had contained critical omissions. She tried to raise her weapon, tried to call out a warning, tried to process how a small-town waitress moved like someone who'd been taught to kill by experts who understood that hesitation meant death. Elena twisted the blade with mechanical efficiency, ensuring that shock and blood loss would prevent any further participation in activities that required coordination or consciousness. The woman slumped against the counter, her weapon clattering to the floor as her nervous system acknowledged that certain functions were no longer available for operational use. "Phantasm," the older man whispered, recognition finally penetrating whatever briefing materials had described Elena as a low-priority asset, suitable for routine elimination. His voice carried the kind of reverence normally reserved for legends that lived in classified files and operations that never officially happened. Elena emerged from behind the prep station with the controlled fluidity of someone whose movements had been calibrated by instructors who measured success in body counts rather than customer satisfaction. The bread knife dripped steadily onto linoleum that had seen spilled coffee and dropped eggs, but never arterial spray from professional operators who'd miscalculated their target's capabilities. "You know that name," Elena said, her voice carrying none of the pleasant accommodation that customers had heard for 3 years. This was someone else speaking, someone who existed in shadows where conversation served tactical purposes rather than social lubrication. "Which means you know what it represents." The older man kept his weapon trained on her center mass, while calculating odds that were shifting rapidly away from favorable outcomes. Professional operators developed instincts about when missions transitioned from routine to catastrophic, and every signal his training had taught him to recognize was screaming that this situation belonged in the second category. "Phantasm was declared Kier 18 months ago," he said with the careful precision of someone stating facts that might prevent immediate violence if delivered with appropriate respect. "Officially terminated during the Belarus incident." Elena smiled with an expression that would have seemed perfectly natural on a waitress discussing weather or local news, but carried implications that had nothing to do with customer service when displayed by someone holding a blood-stained blade. Official reports can be misleading, especially when the subject has reasons to prefer being considered deceased. The man's tactical assessment was reaching conclusions that his mission parameters hadn't anticipated. Phantasm had been described in briefing materials as one of the most effective operatives ever deployed by organizations that specialized in problems requiring permanent solutions. Someone who'd completed assignments that other professionals considered impossible, who'd survived situations that killed entire teams of lesser operatives. "We weren't told," he said with the kind of honesty that emerged when survival required abandoning predetermined scripts in favor of authentic communication. The contract specified a routine termination. Waitress with possible military background. Minimal resistance expected. Elena moved closer with steps that appeared casual, but positioned her within striking distance of someone whose training had emphasized speed and lethality over dramatic presentation. Contracts can be incomplete, especially when clients have reasons to withhold information that might affect fee negotiations. The older man understood that his operational planning had been based on intelligence that was either deliberately falsified or catastrophically inaccurate. Either possibility suggested that someone wanted this confrontation to occur under circumstances that favored Elena's survival over his own, which meant he was facing problems that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. "Who hired you?" Elena asked with the conversational tone of someone requesting clarification about routine business matters rather than conducting interrogation of armed personnel who'd been sent to kill her. "Meridian Group," he replied with the resignation of someone who understood that withholding information from Phantasm was likely to result in significantly more unpleasant methods of extraction. Contract came through normal channels, payment verified, background documentation standard. Elena processed this information with the analytical precision of someone whose survival had often depended on understanding the broader context surrounding apparently isolated incidents. Meridian Group was a legitimate consulting firm that occasionally served as a front for activities that required corporate cover and plausible deniability. Specific client. Compartmentalized. "We only interface with account managers who don't have access to principals." The man's honesty was motivated by tactical considerations rather than cooperative spirit, but Elena appreciated accurate intelligence regardless of the source's motivations. She moved behind the counter with movements that kept her positioned between the operative and potential escape routes, while maintaining clear sight lines that would prevent him from attempting sudden action without warning. Professional courtesy between people who understood that violence was a tool rather than an emotional response. Your team knew you were hunting Phantasm? No, he admitted with the bitter understanding of someone who'd been used by people who considered his survival optional rather than essential. We thought we were handling routine cleanup. Small-town waitress who'd witnessed something inconvenient needed permanent resolution to prevent complications. Elena nodded with appreciation for honesty that confirmed her assessment of the situation. Professional hunters had been deployed against her using intelligence that deliberately understated her capabilities, ensuring that they'd approach the mission with overconfidence rather than appropriate caution. Someone wanted this confrontation to result in specific outcomes that didn't include her elimination. How many others? Just us. Meridian said 3 operators would be sufficient for low-risk termination. His voice carried the kind of embarrassment that came from recognizing professional humiliation in real time. Elena considered this information while maintaining her position and weapon readiness. 3 operatives for someone they believed was an ordinary civilian represented appropriate resource allocation. 3 operatives for someone with her actual background represented either gross incompetence or deliberate sacrifice of assets for purposes that weren't apparent from the tactical level. She was dealing with a situation that extended beyond simple contract killing into territory that involved deception, misdirection, and objectives that required her survival rather than her elimination. Someone had arranged for professional hunters to find her under circumstances that would force her to reveal capabilities she'd spent 3 years concealing. Your extraction plan? Rendezvous with transport at Highway Junction, 1200. Hours. Payment on confirmation of mission completion. The older man was providing information with the efficiency of someone who understood that cooperation might be the only factor preventing his situation from deteriorating further. Elena glanced at the clock above the coffee station, noting that the scheduled extraction was less than 2 hours away. Professional hunters working to specific timelines suggested coordination with other activities that required precise scheduling, which meant someone was orchestrating events that extended beyond her immediate circumstances. Transport details? Helicopter. Corporate registration. Filed flight plan through regional authority. Nothing that would attract official attention or leave problematic records. Elena processed the logistics while maintaining tactical awareness of her immediate environment. Professional extraction using legitimate cover suggested resources and planning that extended far beyond routine contract work. Someone had invested significant effort in creating circumstances that would force her into situations requiring lethal response, while documenting the results through surviving witnesses. She was being tested, evaluated, or recruited through methods that involved considerable risk and expense. Organizations that operated at that level didn't waste resources on casual experiments, which meant her demonstrated capabilities served purposes that justified the cost of professional operatives and complex operational planning. Who's your handler? Account manager named Davidson. Corporate office in Atlanta. Standard communication protocols. The man's answers were becoming more detailed as he recognized that providing useful intelligence might represent his only chance of surviving an encounter that had gone catastrophically wrong. Elena filed the information while considering options that ranged from immediate termination to prolonged interrogation. But movement outside the diner's windows caught her attention. Familiar faces appearing in the parking area with expressions that suggested they'd heard sounds that didn't belong in their quiet morning routine. Jerry Patterson from the construction crew, Mrs. Caldwell with her precisely calculated tips, Dr. Reynolds who dedicated his life to healing people in a community that desperately needed medical care. Good people drawn by noise and concern, approaching a situation they couldn't understand and weren't equipped to handle. Elena felt the weight of decisions that had consequences extending far beyond her immediate survival. These people had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, had welcomed her into their community based on nothing more than her willingness to show up and do good work. They deserved protection from violence that existed in shadows they'd never imagined. "Time to go," she said to the older operative with the matter-of-fact tone of someone ending conversations that had reached their useful conclusion. "What about—" he began, gesturing toward his unconscious companion and deceased teammate. "Local law enforcement will handle cleanup. Your story is that you interrupted a robbery in progress, tried to help, got overwhelmed by numbers and superior firepower. The waitress disappeared during the confusion, probably kidnapped or killed by perpetrators who escaped through the back alley." Elena was providing him with a narrative that would satisfy official investigation while protecting both his survival and the community's peace of mind. Professional courtesy between people who understood that some truths were too complicated for civilian consumption. The older man nodded with recognition that she was offering him a solution that served everyone's interests while requiring nothing beyond his cooperation with predetermined explanations. "And you?" "Elena Vasquez died in this diner," she replied, with finality that left no room for negotiation or clarification. "Phantasm has other business to attend to." She moved toward the back exit with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that civilian safety required removing lethal elements from their environment as quickly as possible. The transformation from waitress to operative was complete, leaving behind 3 years of ordinary life in favor of capabilities that existed in violent shadows. Elena paused at the kitchen door, looking back at the man who'd survived an encounter that had killed his teammates through combination of professional competence and her willingness to show mercy that wasn't required by any operational parameters. "Tell Davidson that Phantasm is interested in discussing employment opportunities. Standard communication protocols, maximum security clearance required." The older operative understood that he was being entrusted with information that had significant value to people who specialized in solving problems that couldn't be handled through conventional channels. "What should I tell him about today?" "Tell him the interview went well." Elena disappeared through the back door into the alley that connected to 3 different streets, vanishing into the morning shadows with the fluid efficiency of someone whose survival had always depended on understanding when circumstances required immediate departure from comfortable positions. Behind her, Rosie's diner contained evidence of violence that would be explained through stories that protected innocent people from truths they weren't equipped to process. The community would mourn the loss of a waitress who'd served coffee and remembered how customers liked their eggs, never knowing that her departure had probably saved their lives. Jerry Patterson and Mrs. Caldwell and Dr. Reynolds would find the older operative administering first aid to his unconscious companion while providing statements to Sheriff Martinez about interrupted robberies and disappeared witnesses. They'd accept explanations that made sense within their experience, grateful that violence had ended without spreading to endanger people who lived peaceful lives in small towns where the biggest excitement usually involved high school sports and disputes over barbecue sauce recipes. Elena reached her Honda in the employee parking area, engine starting with reliable efficiency that carried her away from Millbrook toward highways that led to cities where Phantasm could access resources and capabilities that waitresses didn't require. The rearview mirror showed no pursuit, no complications, no evidence that her departure had attracted attention from anyone who might complicate her transition back to operational status. 3 years of ordinary life had ended with the kind of violence that proved some transformations were only temporary suspensions rather than permanent changes. Elena had tried to disappear, but some identities couldn't be abandoned when circumstances demanded their resurrection. Professional hunters had found her, but they'd served purposes beyond their own mission parameters. Someone had arranged for Phantasm to demonstrate capabilities that 3 years of customer service hadn't erased, creating situations that required lethal responses while documenting the results through surviving witnesses who could provide testimony about effectiveness and precision. Elena drove toward whatever came next, carrying skills that existed in shadows where survival required actions that couldn't be justified through conventional moral frameworks. She'd protected people who'd shown her kindness, eliminated threats that endangered innocent lives, and preserved the peace of a community that deserved better than to become casualties in conflicts they couldn't understand. The performance of ordinary life was over. Phantasm was operational again, awakened from hibernation by circumstances that proved some stories never really ended. They just waited in patient dormancy until necessity demanded their continuation under different names, in different places. Elena had learned that disappearing and staying hidden were different challenges entirely. But she'd also learned that some people were worth protecting regardless of the personal cost, and some communities deserved to remain peaceful even when peace required violence from people who understood the difference between justice and revenge. The highway stretched ahead toward cities where Phantasm could rebuild operational capabilities while Elena's memory preserved 3 years of serving coffee to people who'd treated her with simple human decency. Both identities would coexist. Now, each serving purposes that the other couldn't accomplish alone. Some endings were actually beginnings disguised as conclusions. Some waitresses had stories that extended far beyond customer service. And sometimes the most dangerous person in a small town was exactly who they appeared to be until circumstances forced them to become someone entirely different. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.